I was in my home church and the new pastor started bagging out a particular spiritual practice in which I was actively engaged. He had, over a period of months, criticized certain theological perspectives that were important to me. I felt decidedly underwhelmed by the things he was saying. I was 18 at the time and didn't have the capacity to engage in theological debate with him. The power imbalance would have been too large. And rightly or wrongly, I didn't trust that he would give me a fair hearing. I spoke to a wise, theologically trained leader from the church leadership. To my surprise, this elder ended up agreeing with everything I said. Well, as I said, he was clearly very wise. The question in my mind was echoed by a songwriter of the time. Should I stay or should I go? Should I leave when every sermon I heard could potentially contain a veiled criticism? Did the pastor know what he was doing with what I saw as pot shots? After some time, I ended up leaving with no direct conversations and only a brief letter of resignation. Was I correct to do so? Well, that was over 35 years ago, and if I could talk to my younger self and embolden him, I would do a lot of things differently. And I have had to do that on one or two occasions since. But as I say, I am a lot older now. In these next few podcasts, I want to talk about leaving well, exiting situations that have become unhealthy. It's never an easy thing. I want to make some suggestions for ways to respond as healthily as possible in broken situations. This is Dchurched.com. Welcome. This is a podcast for anyone who has ever had to leave a group or distance themselves from a situation. Why? Maybe it's become toxic, or you are not in the same space anymore. You've changed. Maybe the group you have had to leave is a church and you have had to leave for a whole host of reasons, or just one. It's not that you are angry with those you left, though maybe more of them could have noticed you going. But you reckon most of them are good, caring people. But you've changed, or the circumstances have changed, and for you, that's meant exiting that context. So how do we do that well? How do we do that with a level of integrity, dignity, and grace, but also in a way that doesn't deny our sense of self and have us being wounded again? In this series of podcasts, I want to share some stories, both ancient and modern, that give us insight into leaving well. Also, I will give a list of things of which we need to be aware when deciding whether to leave. I'll post a summary of this on our Facebook page too. Not all situations are the same, so it requires some wisdom, maybe from others, to help you decide whether these suggestions work. What do I mean? Well, for example, what I say in these podcasts will probably not be appropriate where there has been serious abuse. In that situation, name it for what it is, get out as quickly as you can, and contact appropriate authorities, both higher levels of denominational leadership and civil authorities. Or again, where there has been serious emotional manipulation, or where there is a big power imbalance being wielded by a big personality, these suggestions may or may not be helpful. To go back into that situation may demand too much of you. Forgive yourself for walking away. But having said that, also be careful not to give yourself too easy a get out. Being reconciled with others is always challenging. But yes, where there is a power imbalance, I do recognize it's often too demanding emotionally. So, in the words of the Apostle Paul, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Paul elsewhere says, be reconciled to one another. Sometimes that is practically impossible. Talking it out didn't work, and you left or are in the process of moving on. So where does that leave us? Let's start here. Understand some of the meaning of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a mutual word. It requires two people to come together. It requires acceptance of different perspectives and also an ability to rejoice in the difference. But sometimes just one person has power within the community, and unless that person is mature and skilled at inclusion and able to genuinely model acceptance, the weaker party will always feel on the outside. So don't beat yourself up if you weren't in that position of power and had to walk away. And in fact, the same person who again and again in the New Testament said, "Be reconciled to one another," had a huge bust up with a colleague on one occasion. So that phrase, "be reconciled as far as it depends on you," is very relevant at this point. Here's the story. Paul had been on a missions trip and the young Mark had gone with him. Mark left partway through. When Paul was planning another trip, he didn't want to take Mark with him. Scholars debate why not. Perhaps Mark choked at the personal risks or cost. But Paul and Barnabas' name means son of encouragement, so we know what he was like. Paul and Barnabas fought over this unwillingness of Paul to give Mark another crack. The text says it was a sharp disagreement. We can imagine voices being raised and theological shots being fired. But ultimately, they each went their separate ways. Barney took Mark to Cyprus and Paul went elsewhere. Much later in Paul's life, we find that he's reconciled with Mark. We know this because Paul commends him in one of his later letters. In that situation, we don't know who was right or wrong, but the good news of Jesus gets spread even because of their disagreement. Cyprus is reached by Mark and Barnabas, and the good news continues to go out. Was Paul stubborn in the situation? Maybe. But the text says the church commends Paul for the next stage of his journey. It doesn't say that of Barnabas. Perhaps Paul was logical, visionary, and clinical. Mark was young. He had found the trip difficult, and Paul needed those he could rely on if there was persecution. On the other hand, it seems Barnabas was more pastoral, more gentle, seeing the individual, not just the task. Mark was a brother. We can speculate that the differences were down to the drivenness of Paul and the relationally focused heart of Barnabas. Either way, they got out of each other's hair and the good news of Jesus spread. Some were commended, others were ignored by the church, but there was always one who saw their work. My take home from this story is that it's not always clear who's in the right or who's in the wrong. Or even if we need to think in those binary terms. In some situations, we just have to say, I saw things differently and we went our separate ways without justifying ourselves. Sometimes going separate ways is the best of a difficult situation. God has ways of working that out for good, both our own good and for his work. Maybe you've left a church or some other group or organization. For some, that might be a relief to leave, but perhaps it was also painful. And you're left with nagging doubts and feelings of guilt or shame about the way it happened and the fact that it had to happen. I hope that as you process that, you are able to forgive others and also yourself, and not continue to have that sense of guilt or shame, and to walk positively into the future, even if it's away from the community you have known. A future where you're continuing to walk with Jesus outside the walls of the church. Next time in this podcast series, I want to talk about another story that illustrates leaving well. Then I'll give it a list of suggestions that you might be able to use as a checklist for leaving well. My name is Jools. This is Dchurched.com. Thanks for listening. Please join us on our Facebook page and support us through Patreon so that we can continue to finance these podcasts.